right, here it is, the big one.
Oh, hell yeah.
Welcome back to the channel. ItsGheb here, coming back to you guys with another episode of our ongoing Zelda marathon. Sorry this episode took a little bit longer to get out. I'll explain why in a little bit. Last video we talked about Link's Awakening, which you can watch here if you haven't, but long story short, I absolutely loved that game, even though I wouldn't consider it to be one of my favorites in the Zelda franchise. But now we're moving on to what's basically the Zelda game. A game that for a long time many have considered to be the greatest game ever made, the game that has sold more ocarinas than anything else ever before. It's The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. What can you say about Ocarina of Time that hasn't already been said? Like seriously, this is probably the most decorated and revered game of all time. It sold over 7 million copies worldwide, putting it in the top 5 of N64 games sold. It holds the highest spot on Metacritic with a nearly impossible to pass score of 99. You can thank TotalGames.net, MyGamer, Gaming Age, and Total Puppy for spoiling that perfect score. And the awards for various Game of the Year categories were plentiful, but I think the real story is that the number of publications that have gone on record to rank Ocarina of Time as the greatest game to ever be made. And these are just the ones who gave it number 1. Basically any other list that an outlet puts out has this game in the top 20 at minimum. If you were into gaming and you were on the internet during the 2000s and early 2010s, you know just how much of a boner everyone had for this game. I can't really say I'm any different though. I played Ocarina of Time when I was young. So young that I actually can't remember if this was actually the first game I ever played or not. It was one of the first though, and I remember just being enamored by it, but also a bit intimidated. This at the time felt like a massive adventure, and it must have took me months to actually play through everything. When I first played this game, I took it at such a slow pace. Like I would have play sessions where basically nothing was accomplished, but I was just exploring and having fun. I remember one time that I went into the Sacred Grove inside of the Lost Woods a little bit early into the game, and I saw the symbol in front of the Forest Temple, and it matched the one on the inventory screen. I was so interested in this that I called my friend who lived down the street, who I knew also had this game, and asked him about it, and he just said, "Why aren't you following the story?" I would eventually beat Ocarina of Time several times, in fact. I beat it on the original N64, you know, the version of the game that had the Fire Temple chants and Ganondorf puking blood. I had the collector's edition on the GameCube and played it God knows how many times there. I bought it on the Wii Virtual Console and eventually emulated on my PC after I moved away from Nintendo hardware. I played this game a shitload of times. I watched tons of different lore videos, challenges, speedruns. I've even tried speedrunning the game myself before I realized how much I suck. I know a pretty decent amount about this game, and given how many times I've played this game and just how much content I consume about this, it should come as no surprise to you guys, but I love Ocarina of Time, like a lot. This is easily my favorite Zelda game that I have covered so far. Not the overall favorite because that's coming soon, don't you worry, but definitely the best game up to this point. It's been probably close to 10 years since my last playthrough of Ocarina of Time, but the second that Link stepped out into Kokiri Forest, it was like being home again. God, replaying this game was a breeze. I knew exactly where to go, what to do to get heart pieces as soon as I could. There are seriously so many core memories etched into my brain with this game, it's not even funny. This game carries a ton of nostalgic weight for me, maybe even more than what you guys saw in my Kingdom Hearts video, so yeah, I have a lot to say about this one. Which version of the game am I going to do for this playthrough? In my Link's Awakening video, I stressed that I really didn't want to play that game 3 separate times in order to finish that video, so it's going to sound pretty fucking stupid when I tell you guys, for my Ocarina of Time review, I decided to do 4 separate playthroughs. Yep. Well, okay, it's probably closer to like 2.5 or 2.75, but I wanted to get all my bases covered here. I played the original N64 release on an emulator, I played about half of the Master Quest version for the GameCube, I played the 2011 3DS remake, and I played a bit of the 3DS Master Quest version too. Someone help me, I think I have a problem. Suffice to say, this video was quite a big undertaking, so if you guys like what you see throughout the course of this video, maybe consider dropping a like down there because it really does help me bring videos like this to you guys. And hey, if you haven't yet, you should definitely consider subscribing. I'm going to be covering every mainline Zelda game for this marathon, plus a couple of side games here and there, so you guys aren't going to want to miss out on that. But anyway, I've yapped on long enough for this intro. Let's get right into this. We've got a lot to discuss today, so without further ado, this is my review for The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. In this first block, I really wanted to talk about Ocarina of Time's graphics because I actually think it might be one of the most identifiable features of this game. This section of the video, I'll actually break down into both the original and 3DS remake, so let's start by talking about the OG. I honestly still think it's an incredibly visually appealing. Like, don't get me wrong, there's some things that definitely do show their age more than others. My two biggest grievances being the frame rate being locked at 20 FPS and the blurry as fuck textures in Hyrule Castle Town. After 20 minutes or so, my eyes can adjust to a lower frame rate, so it isn't that horrible. But Hyrule Castle Town just looks like straight up shit, I'm sorry. They kind of tried to do this 2D painting overlaid on 3D collision, and I just don't think it holds up very well in the looks department. There are a couple of other areas like this, mainly being the insides of some buildings that have some fixed camera angles, but Hyrule Castle Town is definitely the worst since there are so many NPC models that just contrast so heavily with the background. And why they contrast so hard actually has us moving into some of the more positive things with this game's graphics, with the best probably being the character designs themselves. The art style here really does a lot of heavy lifting. For a lot of people, when they hear someone say Link, this is the Link they think about. And the same goes with Zelda, Ganondorf, or Impa. Added on to this are the level of animations each of the characters have. Now keep in mind, this is still an N64 game we're talking about, one that was still relatively early on in the console's lifespan too. But the amount of facial expressions or unique interactions these characters have definitely show the improvements over something like Super Mario 64, for example. A lot of the animations really do add to this game's charm, with some of my favorite examples being Darunia's dance, Kotake and Koame's bickering, and the awkward shuffle that King Zora does when he can't be bothered to move his fat ass. Though if I had to point to one thing that is hands down the best part about Ocarina of Time's visuals, it has to be the environments and the boss design. The environments outside of Hyrule Castle Town are so visually appealing and identifiable from one another. The tree houses of Kokiri Forest, the maze-like caverns of Goron City, the old building of Gerudo Fortress. These are just some really iconic locations. Probably no better example of this visual splendor comes when you first step out into Hyrule Field. Yeah, while it might seem kind of small and empty by modern standards, at the time that this game came out, I'm not actually sure if there was a larger player space that had the amount of vistas that we actually see here. Seriously, from Hyrule Field, you can stand in one spot and see the entrances to basically all of the game's major areas, with some of the more prominent ones like Death Mountain and Hyrule Castle being able to be seen all the way on the other side of the map thanks to the game's impressive draw distances. And you know, speaking of marveling at things that are big, please don't take that out of context, let's get into the bosses. Holy shit, these guys look fucking awesome. And it's incredible the sense of scale that they can really give the world. I think visually speaking, some of my favorite bosses have to be King Dodongo and Bongo Bongo. They just dwarf Link in size and really do a great job of making these fights feel way more imposing. So yeah, the original version of Ocarina of Time definitely shows its age in a lot of areas, but I think the art style still makes it look visually appealing today, even if it's not the greatest graphical marvel you've ever seen. But in 2011, we got the 3DS remake with one of its biggest flaunted features being a graphical overhaul. So, what do I think of that? Oh, it's so fucking good. Before this video, I had never actually played this version of the game, but Jesus Christ, this game is fucking pretty. We received much higher res textures, more detailed character models, and more in-depth animations, even if some of them do look a little weird. It's just a flat upgrade across the board, except for a few minor things that I take issue with. One of the things that comes to mind right away are the facial animations seeming more flat than they did in the N64 version, and there were a couple graphical changes that I thought took away from the game's atmosphere, like removing the blood from the bottom of the well, and making the final Ganon encounter a bit more well lit. Everything else though, massive glow up. There's no better place to illustrate this than in Hyrule Castle Town. Yeah, night and day comparison, right? You add in all the extra 3D gimmicky stuff, the frame rate being bumped up to 30 FPS, and the text speed being increased something beyond a second grade reading level. Yeah, this is pretty much just a definitive upgrade across the board. Not too much else to say here. This game does a fantastic job of bringing Hyrule to life in the visual department, no matter what version of the game that you're playing. Now on to something that I think most people will agree has stood the test of time, the audio design. I think it's near perfection. From the music to the few times you hear characters' voices to the sound effects, everything here has been executed the highest level possible for a video game for its time. Let's start with the character voices first, since it's one of the few things that does keep this game away from being perfect in my eyes when it comes to the audio. So while Ocarina of Time has by far the most dialogue in the Zelda franchise up until that point, basically none of it's actually voiced. Instead, we really only see text boxes to read, with some occasional random noises uttered by some NPCs. Only a few NPCs really make noises like this, but the ones that do really do get elevated when it comes to their personality, such as Ingo's yell, the Great Fairy's laugh, or just whatever the hell King Zora is doing here. The most iconic of these noises has to be Navi when she says, yeah, everyone knows it. It can be a little annoying from time to time, but for the most part, it's something you can tune out after a while. Now, most N64 games really didn't have a ton of voice acting, so it's not that big of a deal for this game to not have it, but part of me kind of would like to see them make an attempt at it either way. The sound effects are also fantastic across the board. There are just so many noises that provide a serotonin boost to your brain whenever you hear them, from picking up rupees, to finding a key in a chest, to killing a gold Skulltula. It's all great since it provides immediate feedback to the player. Speaking of, audio is used masterfully when it comes to this game's enemies. I just mentioned the gold Skulltulas being a rewarding pickup, but finding them actually becomes a bit of a challenge in of itself, since you kind of have to play a game of hot and cold to find out where they're crawling around. Lots of other enemies have identifiable sounds too, like the wall masters falling from the ceilings, the Deku Scrubs shuffling the leaves, and my personal favorite, the scream that the Redeads give when they're about to face fuck you. Yeah, that noise used to scare the shit out of me as a kid, and I still don't like hearing it today. The thing that really does the heavy lifting for Ocarina of Time's audio is the music, which I mean, come on, this is one of the best OSTs in gaming history. There are so many good tracks in this game. I'm not going to talk about every single piece of music, but I'm going to share with you guys some of my favorites. You have the title theme, Kokiri Forest, Inside the Deku Tree, Hyrule Fields theme, Zelda's theme, Lon Lon Ranch, Kakariko Village, Goron City, The Lost Woods, Zora's Domain, The Great Fairy Fountain, The Temple of Time, Sheik's theme, The Song of Storms, The Forest Temple theme, Gerudo Valley. God, Gerudo fucking Valley, that one is so good. Okay, you guys get the point. There is not a dud in this soundtrack. Every piece of music does an excellent job of elevating the areas or cutscenes you're in. They're all incredibly varied. It's basically perfect. I don't know what else to say. Audio is an easy A+ for me. Let's keep moving. So next I want to talk about the story and setting for Ocarina of Time, and oh boy, strap in, we got some things to get into. I think the first thing I'll talk about is our setting, since this is by far the most developed version of Hyrule that we've seen so far. Ocarina of Time takes place before any of the previous Zelda games, meaning we have new characters, new groups of people, and essentially a very different version of Hyrule. So unlike the Hyrule that we saw in the earlier games, this time around it looks like Hyrule is actually a kingdom that is made up of various groups of different races. Now the Hylians are the main group of people here who basically take up the standard human role, albeit with the pointy ears that are more associated with elves. They're the main ones who populate Hyrule, as well as take up residence in Hyrule Castle, Kakariko Village, and Lon Lon Ranch. Next up we have the Sheikah, which admittedly you only see one member of this race being Impa, so you don't really get to learn too much about them. They are said to be protectors of the royal family, and I think they're the ones who have the most connections with the bottom of the well and Shadow Temple areas in Kakariko Village, but nothing is ever outright stated in-game. It's mostly done in the extended media. Truth be told, at least when it comes to Ocarina of Time, I'm not really sure why the distinction between them and the Hylians even exist. It definitely gets expanded on in later games, especially in stuff like Breath of the Wild, but here it's just kind of nothing. Then there are the Kokiri. These are a group of people who stay children forever, are accompanied by fairies that act as guardians, and reside in Kokiri Forest under the watch of the Great Deku Tree. Kinda think of them as a mix between the kids in Lords of the Flies and the Ewoks from Return of the Jedi, or Wood Elves if you want a more traditional fantasy comparison. Next up are the Gorons, which kind of occupy the dwarf niche, with them living in a mountain, often toiling away in mines, and being great smithers. Though they are bigger than your average dwarf, and really Hylian for that matter, and can also curl into balls and roll around. Also, I'm not sure if there are any Goron women, which makes it extra confusing when a character like Darunia has a son later. Like, how does he actually reproduce? Don't try to research that. After that, there's the Zoras, which kind of give that more traditional elf vibe from a fantasy aspect, but they couldn't be more different. These are an aquatic race of fish people who all worship an even bigger fish, Lord Jabu Jabu. They're housed at the source of fresh water for Hyrule, which is kind of a weird thing to think about since every person in Hyrule who wants to get something to drink has to have something that passes right through King Zora's ass cheeks. Lastly, there are the Gerudo, an entirely female group of thieves that reside out in the desert. They were the last group to swear fealty to the King of Hyrule, only doing it when their king Ganondorf does so in an attempt to follow through with his great plot to take over Hyrule. More on that in a second. Oh, I guess we also have the Deku Scrubs too. They're essentially plant people who also live in Kokiri Forest, but some of the more brave ones have ventured into other areas and even opened up trading shops and dungeons. They're typically hostile, but if you reflect a Deku nut back at them, they'll have a conversation with you and try to scam you. Honestly, these guys have my vote for being the most underutilized race in the entire series, but I think that might be my Majora's Mask bias showing. Now, I love the addition of all these races. I think they do a really great job of adding extra layers to the world that we haven't seen before, and they give Link a great opportunity to learn more about their cultures for an even bigger adventure. So already Hyrule seems like a much more big and diverse place than we've ever seen before, but it gets even better when we actually get to learn more about the lore of Hyrule's creation. This is all explained over the course of the game from characters like the Great Deku Tree or Rauru, as the three goddesses creating the land and all of its inhabitants before leaving the Triforce behind as they ascended back into the heavens. Personally, to me, another aspect I really like when it comes to the lore in this game is a lot of the environmental storytelling that takes place. I'm talking about stuff like the colossal skull in Dodongo's cavern, or the goddess of sand that has a statue out in the front of the spirit temple, or all the fucked up things you find in the bottom of the well in the Shadow Temple. They make Hyrule feel like it has a much more rich history than we're ever explicitly told, and continue to spark conversation among players even to this day. We're even told of some events that happened not too far into the past, such as the Hyrulean Civil War, so you do get a sense of everything we know about the Kingdom of Hyrule, mainly coming from the Hyruleans' perspective, rather than a completely objective recounting of events, which I think is kind of interesting. But now it's time to talk about the story itself, which Ocarina of Time is kind of a weird one to talk about, because while the story itself is pretty simplistic, what it ultimately did to the entire franchise's timeline was basically flip it on its head. So plot synopsis out of the way first. This is Link, a child of the Kokiri who was born without a fairy. Well, one day the Great Deku Tree sends a fairy named Navi to Link in order for him to fulfill a greater purpose. That greater purpose? Stop a man by the name of Ganondorf from essentially taking over Hyrule. We receive an artifact called a Spirit Stone from the Great Deku Tree mere moments before he passes away, and then gets sent to Hyrule Castle to meet with Princess Zelda. It's there that we learn that Ganondorf seems to be trying to capture the Triforce by faking fealty to the King of Hyrule, but Zelda sees through this ruse. She then tasks Link with gathering the two remaining spiritual stones, one from the Goron leader Darunia and one from the Zora Princess Ruto, and Link does just that. But upon returning to the castle, he sees Zelda being chased off by Ganondorf, but she throws the Ocarina of Time to Link before making her escape. Ganondorf confronts Link, but ultimately gives chase to Zelda, letting Link grab the Ocarina and open the door to the Master Sword in the Temple of Time. Upon releasing the seal to the Master Sword, Link opens the door to the Sacred Realm for the Triforce to be claimed, but this was Ganondorf's plan all along, and he sneaks in behind Link and claims the Triforce for himself. 7 years pass as Link's current age was too young to properly wield the Master Sword, but he then awakens in the Chamber of Sages as Rauru tells him he must free all 7 sages in order to put a stop to Ganondorf. See, in the 7 years that Link has been asleep, Ganondorf has essentially taken over Hyrule. Link awakens again in the Temple of Time, where he meets a mysterious character by the name of Sheik, who essentially guides Link on saving the sages that he actually met during his childhood. Saria of the Kokiri, Darunia of the Gorons, Ruto of the Zoras, Impa of the Sheikah, and Naboru of the Gerudo. After this is done, Link meets back up with Sheik at the Temple of Time, who reveals that they were actually Zelda all along. She then explains why Ganondorf stole the Triforce, and it was actually split into 3 pieces, with Ganondorf only receiving the Triforce of Power, while Link and Zelda receive the Triforce of Courage and Wisdom respectively. And immediately after she reveals her presence, Ganondorf kidnaps her, since maybe breaking your disguise in Ganondorf's literal backyard wasn't the smartest move. Are we sure she's the one that has the Triforce of Wisdom? Anyways, you go to Ganondorf's castle, we learn that he moonlights as an organ player for his local church, energy tennis, bing bang boom, he's dead, but with his final breath he attempts to take down the castle with us inside of it. We get this Metroid-style escape sequence, but right when we think it's all over, Ganondorf springs back to life and uses the Triforce of Power to turn into the monstrous beast Ganon. He swats away the Master Sword, but thanks to the combined efforts of Link, Zelda, and the other sages, you perform the coup de grace on Ganon by stabbing a bitch in the face. You then seal Ganondorf in the Sacred Realm, who vows his revenge on everyone. And as a final thank you, Zelda sends Link back in time so he can have the childhood that was taken away from him. When returning to this time, Navi leaves since her duty was fulfilled, and Link meets with Zelda before all of Ganondorf's actions begin in order to prevent them from ever happening in the first place. Pretty obvious, but this is the most story-focused game that we've seen in the Zelda franchise up until this point. We get way more cutscenes, a ton of more optional dialogue to read through, and it's easily the highest amount of characters too. When talking about the characters, I think we have a pretty solid cast here. Link, being honest, is pretty much as one note as ever. Link is still complete mute unless you're in gameplay and all you hear is with maybe the most emotion that you see from him in a cutscene is when he realizes that Twin Rova is kind of a baddie. Which, I mean, can you blame him for having that reaction? Zelda is definitely the most likable version that we've seen up until that point, which I also think is kind of interesting since we get to see how she changed from when she was a child to when she was grown up 7 years later. Ganondorf made his debut in this game, and I mean, what can you really say about him? He became the main villain for the majority of Zelda games after this for a reason. Yeah, technically he was name dropped in A Link to the Past, but let's be real here, this is the Ganondorf everyone thinks of when they hear his name. That or the thirst trap version from Tears of the Kingdom. I really didn't mean for this review to be this horny. Sheik as the character I think is pretty cool. I kind of wish we get to see them do a bit more than teach us songs and give vague metaphorical exposition, but hey, they're fine for what they are. I also kind of wish we get to see more of them in the Zelda series, but it is what it is. This is also the first game that had our first partner character being Navi the Fairy. Yeah, a lot of games after this really ran with this trope, and for the first iteration of having a partner, Navi is okay. She really doesn't contribute much to the game outside of being the initial reason Link sets out on his adventure, and then just abruptly leaving at the end. She'll still constantly remind you she's there, give you insight on enemy weaknesses, but she is far from my favorite companion in the series. She basically just serves as an endless source of tutorials and exposition, which sometimes is fine, but other times she'll tell you about something that you either already know or you're already doing. Oh, the worst of this was in my Master Quest playthrough of 3D. Since I already had to play through the base game to even unlock it, and Navi still had to talk about stuff like trying to teach me how to open a door. And don't even get me started on the owl Kapora Gabora, who hits you with text walls, and then when he asks if you want to hear it again, the default answer is yes. That shit gets me even when I'm expecting it. Speaking of side characters, I think the supporting cast that we have is okay for the most part. Each of the sages have the role of teaching Link a sort of lesson of growth, but I do wish they had a bit more screen time, especially with someone like Impa or Naboru, who you basically see like 4 or 5 times in total maybe. Most of the other ones are kind of forgettable, but some have some fun personalities and can provide some interesting interactions for Link to be a part of. I think my favorite of these side characters has to be the giant Goron on Death Mountain for needing eye drops and also talking like how Miles raps.
In Rosa Parks, I feel like we made it out the park, but
overall, I think the story of Ocarina of Time is a pretty solid addition to the series. Except it also makes things way more complicated. So what do I mean by that? Well, guys, it's time we talk about the Zelda timeline.
stop it, please, I beg you!
Alright, it's not as bad as talking about something like the Kingdom Hearts timeline or the chronology for something like Warframe. I mean, Jesus, just look at this shit. But things definitely start to get a little bit more complicated from here. So for the most part, the Zelda chronology was a pretty straightforward ride until this game. You had a Link to the Past, followed by Link's Awakening, and then you had a new Link for Zelda 1 and 2 take place after. Well, when Ocarina of Time came out, it was originally planned to be the game that took place during the Imprisoning War, which was detailed in A Link to the Past, except the details aren't exactly one-to-one. Add on to the fact that a little later after Ocarina of Time was released, our man Siggy Shiggy actually said that the order was Ocarina of Time, Zelda 1, Zelda 2, and then A Link to the Past. Link's Awakening, the Shigmeister said just throw it anywhere after Ocarina of Time. It wasn't until we got the Hyrule Historia in 2011 did we have the official timeline, because it was honestly just starting to become a fucking mess. So in this timeline that had been adopted as truth by most of the community, it starts out pretty tame with Skyward Sword, Minish Cap, and then 4 swords. Then Ocarina of Time comes around and actually serves as a diverging path for a few different routes. First we have what is called the Child Timeline, which takes place after Link travels back to the past and notifies Zelda of Ganondorf's schemes, where the Sacred Realm remains protected. In this timeline we have Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and 4 Swords Adventure follow it. Next we have the Adult Timeline taking place after Ganondorf was sealed in the Sacred Realm, with Link being sent back in time. After that, we have Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks all take place. Now those 2 timelines I always thought were fine and they made sense. However, a third timeline also exists called the Fallen Hero Timeline, where Link dies and Ganon is allowed to succeed in his plan. This timeline includes A Link to the Past, Oracle of Ages and Seasons, Link's Awakening, Zelda 1, and finally Zelda 2, which this timeline was also slightly changed when the Zelda Encyclopedia chose to swap the places of the Oracle games in Link's Awakening, and then added A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Hero before Zelda 1.
Did you get that?
No!
And I know what you're probably thinking. Where does Link's crossbow training fit into all of this? But anyways, while I think the child and adult timelines make sense, the Fallen Hero timeline was always weird and kind of a lazy way of explaining things to me. Like, is this supposed to be like a what-if scenario? Because Link never really gets killed in Ocarina of Time. Does it happen if Link dies to Ganon in the final battle, or can he just fall and break his ankles inside of the Great Deku Tree and never get out? A lot of people refer to A Link to the Past manual as a detailing of how the Fallen Hero timeline plays out, but it never actually makes any mention of Link or another hero being killed at the hands of Ganondorf, so honestly, your guess is as good as mine. Personally, if I was to have my headcanon and I was allowed to change a couple of things with Ocarina of Time, I would probably do this. Have Ganondorf still turn into Ganon at the end during this timeline, since he stays Ganon throughout the entire thing. have him mortally wound Link in the final battle, and as a callback to when Zelda threw Link the Ocarina of Time to save her, have him do the same thing so she can go back in time and cast her spell to hold Ganon so Link can deliver the final blow. This adds a bit of a dramatic scene near the end of the game, gives Zelda a little bit more of something to do, and most importantly, neatly sets up the 3 timelines to proceed forward. If you guys like that idea, let me know. I think it would have really tied up Ocarina of Time perfectly in order to set up the 3 different timelines, but anyways, enough of the fan fiction, let's wrap it up with the story. And keep in mind too, the Zelda timeline is bullshit. It's nothing but a series of retcons and essentially tries to fit so many square pegs in round holes that it's basically been held back in preschool for 14 years at this point. You can basically just ignore it. At the end of the day, Ocarina of Time's story isn't the most groundbreaking thing in the world, but I really enjoyed it. The larger focus on cutscenes and dialogue really give us a greater sense of who these characters are. The game explores themes such as the after effects of war and growing up too fast, and most importantly of all, this game establishes so much that basically every 3D Zelda game follows up on, and some of the 2D entries too. Locations such as Lake Hylia, Zora's Domain, and the Temple of Time, the additional races, figures like the Great Deku Tree, having a companion character, it's all been done time and time again, and we have OOT to thank for it. If A Link to the Past laid down the foundation, then Ocarina of Time built the house on top of it that basically every other Zelda game would take the blueprint of, up until Breath of the Wild, that is. It's good. I don't think it has much emotional weight as something like Link's Awakening, Skyward Sword, and Majora's Mask, so I don't like it as much in the story department. But at the same time, this is the most Zelda a Zelda game can really be. It's the standard bearer. It's the one that every game after it said, we're going to do that, but slightly different. And for that, I think it's still a commendable title. And that's just for the story. We haven't even gotten to the gameplay yet, which you could probably say is even more influential than anything else. Now, much like the story, Ocarina of Time looked to take what A Link to the Past built and expand and innovate on it while also bringing it into the 3rd dimension. So how did it do? Yeah, this was probably one of the most successful transitions from 2D to 3D that we saw in that era. I'll talk about some things that are pretty much in the standard version of Ocarina of Time, and I'll reserve the 3DS changes for its own section of the video later on. Let's begin with the basics with the way that Link controls. So now that we have the advent of the N64 analog stick, Link is fully capable of walking in 360 degrees of movement, and it feels so good to have finally gotten here. He can also now jump without the need of the Roc's Feather, albeit he needs to be running towards a ledge to automatically perform this. Link's default walking speed is a bit on the slow side, but if you lock the camera, you can have Link walk backwards, which is for some reason far faster than moving forwards. Now, when I said lock the camera, what I mean by that is in the majority of areas, you'll be able to freely roam around them in a 3D space with the camera in a fixed position behind you. If you want to recenter your camera behind Link, you can do so with the click of a button. This is a good system because 3D cameras were honestly kind of a crapshoot at the time for how helpful they were, or if you were going to get them stuck on terrain. One thing that helps tremendously with this is the Z targeting. Essentially, this allows Link to focus in on a target to ensure all of his attacks are aimed towards them. Projectiles are shot in that direction, he can move while keeping his shield up, he can use Navi to scan the enemy for their weaknesses, and he can perform dodges and strafe. It's basically how 99% of the combat is handled in this game, and it's something that pretty much everyone knows about either from this game or from something else. I'm not 100% sure if Ocarina of Time was the game that invented this system, but you better believe that every 3D action game afterwards used it after OOT came out. Assassin's Creed, Kingdom Hearts, Dark Souls, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, God of War, Monster Hunter, Grand Theft Auto, even new games like Black Myth Wukong are still using some variation of this system. The first iteration that was done really right is here in Ocarina of Time, and pretty much every game I mentioned kind of owes it to OOT. It's not like completely perfect or anything, my main issue being sometimes locking onto an enemy can be proximity based, with some enemies jumping around a bit that can be a little disorienting, but it's still a pretty phenomenal first attempt. The other big innovation for just controlling Link is the larger focus on context-sensitive buttons. This was started a little bit in A Link to the Past, but it's used to a much greater effect here. The A button is kind of reserved as a catch-all now. It can open doors and chests, pick up rocks and pots, be used to talk to NPCs and read signs, push and pull blocks, climb up ledges, sheath your weapon, or roll around on the ground. The icon up here for the A button will change depending on the situation, which is nice since it's a good way to keep the control scheme simple, but still gives the player a lot of options to let them know what they're doing. Next, let's get into Link's inventory, which there's not exactly a lot of new toys to play with, but given that they're now in a 3-dimensional space, there are going to be some things that changed a little bit. The items can essentially be broken down into 3 categories: inventory, equipment, and quest items. Now, inventory is pretty straightforward. These are items that you can use by tying them to one of the C buttons, of which there are 3 this go around. And with one of them not being taken up by the sword, this is a massive step in the right direction from Link's Awakening. Returning items we have are the boomerang, bombs, bow, hookshot, and hammer that act mostly like how they did in A Link to the Past. There are some differences, like being able to use the hookshot underwater and going into first person mode or an over the shoulder third person when you wish to use any of the ranged options, but they mostly act the same. Side note, I hate the inverted aim that all of these items have. Like, I know it was sort of the way things were at the time, but it's something that I always get turned around on. Bottles also make their return, and once again, they're one of the best items in the game. You can still put potions and fairies in them, but now you can also fill them with milk for restoring HP in 2 doses, bugs for finding secrets in the mounds, fish and blue fire to help with some puzzles, and pose, which you can sell at shops. And also, yes, they are the gamer way of fighting off Ganondorf's energy tennis. You sometimes will also have to get quest-specific items that you need to present to certain NPCs, but these are pretty few and far between. And finally, we have the ocarina taking place of the flute, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. As for new items, our lineup is just sort of okay. It's not the most exciting thing in the world. For starters, we have a stick. How exciting. No, but actually, the Deku Stick is one of the best early game items. Link actually uses it as a 2-handed weapon, and it does a bit more damage than his Kikiri sword does. And he can set the stick on fire to light torches or burn spider webs. Next up are the Deku Nuts, which can be thrown to stun enemies. It's a good item, if a bit on the underutilized side. I think it would have been really cool to have some more enemies that needed to be stunned in order to kill them, but it is what it is. Then there's a slingshot, which is pretty much just young Link's version of the bow. That's really it. The Lens of Truth makes its debut here, which at the cost of some magic can reveal objects and creatures that are invisible. It's kind of cool, and I also like how you can skip it entirely if you know where these things are naturally. Probably the coolest new item of the game has to be the Bomb Chew. Essentially, it's a bomb that will walk forward and climb on walls until it explodes onto something. Again, it's only needed like twice in the main game, so it's not utilized as much as it should be, but still pretty cool item. Then there are the magic beans. You buy them from this fat fuck who constantly raises the price after you make your purchase.
Now, how about a rose for the lady? $5 a pop.
I'll take one.
Oh, yeah? Well, I want one too.
$8.
But you just said...
Demand suddenly skyrocketed. You all saw it.
Yeah, it's not like he's just sitting there literally eating his own supply or anything. But anyways, you plant them in these dirt patches that I mentioned earlier, and when you're an adult, they turn into platforms that Link can ride on. Oh, just a couple more things. We have the elemental arrows that either apply a fire, ice, or light affinity to your bow. The fire one is necessary for a few puzzles later on. The light one's a requirement for going through the final dungeon, but the ice arrows, honestly, you could skip them. They're strong, but I wouldn't exactly say they're worth the effort to get. And speaking of which, we have the spells, which are also sort of underwhelming. Din's Fire is definitely the best of the 3, allowing Link to cast an AoE Fire Blast in his area. This is basically a must-have for opening the Shadow Temple, and it's got some combat purposes too, so it's fine. Then there's Ferore's Wind. I never use it. It's supposed to act like an escape rope if you're in a dungeon, but requires a bit of setup. You essentially place down a point with one cast and can return to it with a second, which I guess can be kind of helpful if you have the foresight of where you need to come back to, but I feel like the dungeons are crafted in such a way that it's never really hard to get to where you need to go, but to each their own, I guess. And finally, we have Neru's Love, which gives Link a shield, making him invulnerable to damage. Not bad, but I didn't find myself needing it too much. Okay, thankfully the other 2 categories are much easier to get through. First, we have the equipment section, which will let Link change his items that he is currently wearing. For the swords, we have the Kikiri sword, which is a short but weak starter weapon, the Master Sword, which is our main weapon throughout the majority of the game, and the Big Goron sword, which is so big that we can't properly use a shield, but it deals massive amounts of damage. I basically use this to make a joke of every single boss. For shields, we have the Deku Shield, which is small and made of wood so it could potentially burn up, the Hylian Shield, which is our standard metal shield, and the Mirror Shield, which can be used to reflect magical attacks and light for puzzles. We also have the different tunic options, such as the Goron and Zora tunic for surviving in extreme heat and breathing underwater, and different boot options, such as the Iron and Hover boots that increase Link's weight or gives him a slight hover when he's running off ledges, respectively. Some of these items can either only be used by either adult or young Link, with the standard boots, tunic, and the Hylian Shield being the only things that crosses over, even if young Link can only use that shield while turtling. These are all changed on a screen in the pause menu rather than having them be equipable items, which definitely has its problems, let me tell you. This screen will also display the various upgrades that you can get to things such as your bombs, slingshot, and arrow capacities, as well as strength upgrades for moving heavy objects, and the Zorafins for diving underwater to further distances. Finally, there are the quest items, which this screen basically acts as a progression checklist for things such as spiritual stones, medallions, gold skulltulas, heart pieces, things like that. The most interesting thing I think I can talk about here is how some of the medallions still have the symbols for some of the content that Ocarina of Time was originally going to have. That's why the forest and water medallions have symbols that look a lot closer to wind and ice. Apparently these medallions were going to have some sort of use originally, with most people assuming that they would have acted like the spells that we have, which, you know, I could kind of see, since those spells do kind of line up with the symbols of the medallions for the first 3 adult dungeons. Actually, let's jump into the dungeons and bosses real quick while we're here. I love the dungeon lineup in this game. Not every one of them is a winner, but I think this is where the dungeons in the series went from fun areas to challenge the player to being a large part of the world that they're in. We have 9 main dungeons and 3 mini dungeons, so let's go right down the list. First is the Great Deku Tree as our tutorial dungeon, and while it is a very simplistic one to run through, how fucking cool is it that this is our introduction to a 3D dungeon in the series? It's already in a way more unique and important area than any of the prior 2D games, so I think it set the tone perfectly for the rest of the game. The boss here is Goma, which is a pretty familiar boss for previous players, but I think it makes sense as a tutorial boss. Next is the Dongo's Cavern, which is kind of just an okay one for me. Kind of a cool setup with the giant skull, but not too much to note here. King Dodongo is one of those get the fuck back here type of bosses sometimes, but can go down pretty quick. Jabu Jabu's Belly is often considered one of the worst dungeons in the game by many people, and they're right. You get swallowed alive by this giant fish, which is way larger on the inside than outside, and you have to move around through its innards, essentially going through these sphincter-shaped doors, escorting Princess Ruto, having everything inside undulate. Hell, you have to hit the thing's uvula with a slingshot in order to get further into the dungeon. Baronade is the boss here, which is like a 3-phase boss that has hyper armor half the time, so it's definitely the most challenging of the 3 Young Link encounters. Between this and the inside of Monstro from Kingdom Hearts, it's no wonder why so many early 2000s kids grew up with a Vor kink. Why the fuck did I write that? Anyways, onto the adult dungeons, and this is where the real showstoppers are. First up being the Forest Temple, one of my personal favorite dungeons in the entire series. It's essentially this spooky mansion that has you try to reignite the 4 flames in the main chamber by killing the Poe sisters. It's got such a weird vibe to the place, unlike anything else in the game. The only thing I had to ask is, what does this have to do with the forest? Like, I think the opening room with this tree that you have to climb up is the only foresty thing we see here. You'd think if anything that this would be called the Spirit Temple since, well, there's a ton of spirits here. Considering this was originally supposed to be the Wind Temple, I would imagine this is one of the last temples to actually be put together, but hey, it honestly worked, so I can't complain too much. Phantom Ganon is the boss here, making his debut appearance, and he is easily one of the most iconic bosses in the game. Next is the Fire Temple, which is just sort of a whatever dungeon for me. It's cool that we have to rescue all the Gorons throughout the dungeon, but there isn't exactly much that stands out outside of this room that I fell down once when I was a kid and I always get anxiety crossing over now. Volvagia is the boss here, and he's a pretty good one, with my only complaint that he flies around a bit too much, but you are able to hit him while he's flying if you have some proper positioning. After that, we have our first mini dungeon, the Ice Cavern. It's definitely a cave filled with ice, that's for sure. You've got your ice block puzzles, you've got the blue fire. I think they didn't really have a whole lot of ideas for an ice dungeon, so it just kind of got salvaged into this. And what we got instead was the Water Temple. Okay, this dungeon isn't that bad, but let's be real. It's the worst adult dungeon, and maybe even the worst dungeon in the game. The issue is that you need a fuck ton of keys to find everything in this dungeon, which means scouring every room, which in order to do that, you'll either need to change the water level, which can be hard to find since a lot of the rooms look the same, or put on your iron boots and walk around underwater. Well, you can't use your sword underwater and are limited to your hook shot, which already isn't great, but you'll also need to swap your iron boots on and off constantly. Not to mention, some of the keys are in spots that can be kind of easy to miss. Everyone talks about the raised platform in the middle room, or the time block behind the long shot, but mine is always the room directly above Ruto. I don't know why, but I forgot that one in both of my playthroughs. The main boss being Morpha doesn't help either. You either trap this blob in the corner and single cycle him, or you get one hit in and miss 20 times with your hook shot before getting another attack, and there's nothing in between. The changes to this one alone are probably the greatest reason to play the 3DS remake, but more on that later. For our second mini dungeon, we actually go back in time to play as Young Link, and we go to the bottom of the well, which holy fuck, what a vibe change. This might actually be the darkest area in any Zelda game. It's seriously kind of fucked up. From the enemies you face, to all the fake out doors and invisible floors, to the blood and corpses everywhere, this dungeon almost feels like it's from a different type of game. Same goes for the Shadow Temple. This is like a continuation on what we just saw. Very creepy, very filled with mystery. It's one of the most linear dungeons in the game, but also one of my favorites. Bongo Bongo, also known as the man with the most muscly back in gaming, is here, and it's a pretty fun, albeit easy encounter. One of my other favorite dungeons is next with the Spirit Temple. I love the desert pyramid vibe it has going on. I love how you could do half this dungeon as young Link and the other half as an adult. I love all the light redirecting puzzles. I love how you can use the hookshot to grab onto the statue's nipples and the game damages you for being a fucking weirdo. It's all great. Twin Roba is the boss here and is definitely one of my favorite in this game, mainly because it's really fun to reflect the elemental blasts. Then there is the Gerudo Training Grounds. It's just a series of loosely connected rooms with their own challenges for a lackluster reward. You can skip it. Finally, we have Ganon's Castle, which essentially acts as a gauntlet of mini challenges that also kind of lends credence to the idea of the Forest and Water Temple originally being the Wind and Ice Temple, as well as some other content from the Cut Light Temple. Outside of that, it's a pretty short run up to the final boss. The fight with Ganondorf is basically the same as the Phantom Ganon fight, with the big Goron sword making it a complete joke, but the final encounter with Ganon is some real shit. He swipes away your Master Sword, you can really only see his tail super well, and he doesn't have a subtitle on his name. It's just Ganon. You know who this is, motherfucker. Great final encounter, one of my favorites in the franchise. The enemy design outside of the bosses is pretty spectacular too. When locking onto an enemy, Navi can give you a hint on how you can take them down. Most enemies have their own weakness that you can exploit, and there are a shit ton of enemies here, so I won't name them all, but I'll highlight some of my favorites. The Skull Tools are fun since they teach the player to attack at the right moment when they show their weak point, and they remain a threat late into the game when they become invisible. The Wolfos have a really cool mechanic where hitting their tail is an instant kill if you can get the timing down. The Likes, once again, are public enemy number 1 since they can eat your shield, but also your tunics. Also, this one in Ganon's Castle deserves a special place in hell for launching you off the edge. The Stalfos, Iron Knuckle, Lizalfos, and Dark Link all do an excellent job of testing the player's knowledge of blocking, dodging, and attacking at the right times throughout various points of the game. The two enemies that have stuck with me the longest are probably the ones that most people would assume if they played Ocarina of Time before, being Redeads and Dead Hand. So imagine being 5 years old and coming across one of these guys. You're just running along, you go to check the graveyard in Kakariko, and you see this thing sitting in the corner. You try to run by it, but it gets up and screams at you, paralyzing you as it slowly walks forward. And then this happens. Oh god. See this? This is what the face of a victim looks like. These guys were terrifying to me as a kid, and honestly, I still hate getting caught in their scream today. When you walk out of the castle town after grabbing the Master Sword, I immediately beeline it the fuck out of there because I straight up don't want to deal with any of those guys. The other main source of trauma in my life comes with Dead Hand. What the fuck is this thing? Like, you get grabbed by one of its hands and then it does this super unnatural shuffle towards you and just... ugh. They definitely made this one of the creepiest Zelda enemies of all time, and I'm kind of surprised we only ever see it in this game. You'd think it'd come back in a more edgy game like Twilight Princess or Majora's Mask, but nope, just in Ocarina of Time. Though combat isn't the only thing that Link has this time around, let me introduce you to the stealth mechanics. They fucking suck. Okay, you literally only need to use stealth for the visit to Hyrule Castle and the Gerudo Fortress, and at least with the Gerudos you can knock them out, but this isn't Metal Gear Solid by any means, let's leave it at that. They just serve as means to add activities in between dungeons, which is honestly really nice. They have a lot more fun events this go around to spice things up in areas before the dungeon capstones them, such as befriending the Gorons by playing Saria's song to Darunia, racing Dampé to get the hookshot, or finding the letter Ruto addressed and giving it to King Zora. You can blow through these if you're trying to beat the game in like 15 to 20 hours, but a normal playthrough will probably last close to 30, making it by far the longest Zelda game released to that point, but not something that overstays its welcome by any means. There are plenty of environments that you will travel through as well. Some, such as Kakariko Village, Kokiri Forest, Goron City, or Zora's Domain, will act as towns for the player where he can talk to NPCs, go to shops to stock up on items, do minigames, you know, standard action-adventure fare. Then you have areas that are more traversal related, such as Hyrule Field, Death Mountain, Zora's River, or Lake Hylia, that are more road bumps to your next destination than anything else. An interesting thing here is that this game does have a day-night cycle, where certain NPCs will not be seen at certain points of the day, and some enemies will only show up in locations if it's nighttime. It doesn't have a ton of bearing on the gameplay like you might think it does, with maybe the most notable thing being the gates to Hyrule Castle Town being closed during the evenings, but that's sort of it. Strangely enough, different areas' times flow differently too. So while you're in Hyrule Castle Town, it will always be whatever time you walked into it, but if you were to go to Hyrule Field, time moves very quickly. It's a concept that was definitely expanded upon in later games in the series, so it might seem a little underbaked by comparison here. General gameplay wise though, Ocarina of Time really set the standard for all 3D Zelda games that came after it. I really don't have too much more to say about it. It's a very comfortable 25 to 30 hour adventure that just blows by in a breeze, so yeah, let's move on. But let's say you really do want to push Ocarina of Time to that 40-hour mark and you want to complete everything that the game has to offer. Thankfully, this one has a lot of side activities for you to do. Let's talk about the big one first, the trading quest to get the big Goron sword. I think this might be the most famous item trading quest from any game, but essentially you go through an incredibly long chain of useless items, trading your way up to get the strongest sword in the game, being the big Goron sword. It's 100% worth your time. This sword does like double the damage of the Master Sword and has a way longer reach, and most of the item trading can get done right after the Forest Temple, so you might as well get this thing as soon as possible. The other big side quest that I think a lot of people think is actually mandatory, but it's not, is getting your horse Epona. Yeah, did you know that you don't actually need to get Epona? Until I was doing research for this video, I always thought she was a requirement. She is for sure a quality of life edition and the extra most bestest horse you've ever seen, but you technically don't need her because the long shot is fully capable of getting you across the gap in Gerudo Valley. I'd still get her though. You move across Hyrule Fields so much faster, you can hop over fences, and you can use your bow on horseback to kill the big pose in order to get the final bottle. Which, speaking of, there are a ton of smaller side quests that go around too. You have stuff like that, the Gerudo Training Grounds, Dampy's Grave Game, which I got the heart piece on the first try because I'm a fucking gamer, the Bomb Shoe Shop minigame, the shooting galleries, the concert with the Skull Kid, planting all the magical beans, the fishing hole, which I spent way too much time in. There are a lot of minigames here. We even see another trading mini quest where young Link goes around and trades these masks for the Happy Mask Salesman. Oh, how he doesn't know what he's getting himself into. You get the Mask of Truth, which allows you to read the gossip stones around Hyrule for that sweet, sweet lore. Beyond that, we have the heart piece collecting that we're pretty used to by this point, and the new edition of Gold Skulltulas. So in this house in Kakariko, there's a cursed family that has been turned into Skulltulas that can revert back if you collect all the golden Skulltula tokens. You get these by killing these enemies and either touching the token or using the boomerang or hookshot to bring them to you. It's a fun little side activity, and you can get some pretty good upgrades like the wallet upgrade, the Stone of Agony, which can help you find some more secrets, and the final upgrade being unlimited money for a game that really doesn't have much to spend on. Yeah, I didn't really go for it this time around. There really isn't that much of a point in doing so, especially since some of the Skulltulas are in dungeons and I didn't want to have to backtrack into those. Regardless of that lackluster reward, I'd honestly recommend doing most of the side content in this game. I feel like the big Goron sword and the Epona quest are something you 100% should do, but the others are nice in a sense that they do add a bit more to the gameplay variety if you want to take a break from doing dungeons or earn some optional rewards. Overall, it's hands down the most side content a Zelda game had at the time, and I think it really adds a ton to the experience. So there are probably some of you wondering why I haven't talked about OOT's two defining features yet. These two things are essentially the main gameplay gimmick for Ocarina of Time, being the Ocarina and Time. So yeah, Ocarina of Time's main gameplay gimmicks, let's start off with the Ocarina. So early on in Link's quest, he's actually given an Ocarina that he can play at any given time. Now at first, it doesn't really serve much of a purpose. You can pull it out, have a little jam session, but other than that, it's pretty pointless. But as Link goes through the game, he will slowly learn new songs that will allow him to do various things. Zelda's Lullaby will give him access to areas that the royal family has clearance towards, the Sun Song will change the time of day, Saria's song will give Link hints on what to do, Epona's song will call Epona and get milk from cows, the Song of Storms will call down rain, and the Song of Time will move blocks. Okay. You can also add on the optional Scarecrow song that you can use to summon the Scarecrow at certain options that you can hookshot onto. Did anyone else just use down A repeatedly for all 8 notes for the Scarecrow song, or was that just me? Later on, Link will also get various teleportation songs that can bring him near entrances for the 5 main temples and the Temple of Time. You play all of these on a 5-note scale, which must have been very difficult to actually create some catchy tunes for, but they found a way to make this system work, even though I don't think it's perfect. I think the teleportation songs are kind of dumb since you have to learn 6 different melodies just to travel to a particular spot, rather than having like one song and then being able to choose your destination. Also, stuff like the Spirit Temple entrance is basically worthless since it's so cut off from every other area in the game. That and the standard songs are kind of just a mixed bag. Stuff like the Song of Storms and Saria's song are only used a couple times for progression and then basically only get used for optional content. And the Song of Time being relegated to the block moving song is kind of lame. The focus on music is fun, and it's definitely better than having the limited songs that we saw in the earlier games. but I still think a little bit more could be done with it. Ocarina of Time's other main gimmick is being able to play as young Link and adult Link at 2 different points of time. So after collecting all spiritual stones, young Link can pull the Master Sword out from the Temple of Time, and he goes 7 years into the future and becomes adult Link. This does a number of different things. First off, there are certain items that can only be used by either Link. Young Link can't use stuff like the Master Sword, Mirror Shield, Bow, Hookshot, or Hammer because he isn't big enough to wield them. And adult Link can't use the Deku Shield, Slingshot, Deku Stick, Magic Beans, or Masks because I guess he thinks he's too grown up now or something. The world around Link also changes too. Hyrule Castle is now destroyed and filled with Redeads, Zora's domain is frozen, Lake Hylia is drained of water, all of the Gorons on Death Mountain are abducted, Lon Lon Ranch has been taken by Ingo, and Kokiri Forest has been overrun with monsters. Now as adult Link, you are able to change some of these things, but others you are not. There are some things about the world that suck now. Welcome to adulthood, please look forward to dying in 50 years. Now after you complete the Forest Temple, you can place the Master Sword back in the pedestal at the Temple of Time and return to your childhood, where you can do some things to influence the future, such as plant magic beans or teach the Scarecrow song so adult Link can use them later on, or more notably, getting the silver gauntlets in the Spirit Temple. And vice versa, you will do stuff such as getting the Song of Storms as an adult, and then going back in time and playing it in front of the person who teaches you it, which goes against the established rules of time travel in this game, but I really don't want to get into that. So all this stuff is good. I think a little bit more could be done here. Just as we start doing some really interesting stuff like learning the Song of Storms and playing half the Spirit Temple as young Link, we're already at the end of the game and it only feels like we're scratching the surface of what's possible here. I would have loved another dungeon or two that take advantage of the 2 different Link's abilities, but maybe they thought that having to go back to the Temple of Time constantly would have been a bit of a pace breaker, which fair enough, I can totally see that. If again, I had it my way and technical limitations weren't an issue, I would have had the Song of Time switches back and forth between the 2 Links and have the world flip kind of like how it did in A Link to the Past, but given the amount of cut content, it probably wasn't feasible for this to happen. Regardless of all of this, the 2 main gimmicks in this game are good, are fun. I think a little bit more could have been done with them, but later games in the series do kind of run with these ideas a bit. Given everything that was already built up from A Link to the Past and brought into the 3rd dimension, I can't really complain here. It's still super well done, I still had a really great time, and it makes the gameplay for Ocarina of Time just an absolutely phenomenal experience. But wait, we've got a little bit more to talk about before we move on. First, I want to talk about the Master Quest version that was released for the GameCube that was a pre-order bonus for the Wind Waker. Yeah, they don't do pre-orders like this anymore now, do they? So the Master Quest version of Ocarina of Time is a lot like the second quest in the original Zelda, where the overworld is mostly the same, but all the dungeons have been rearranged to be far more difficult. So what does that look like, you might be wondering? Well, it's certainly something, let's say that. They're definitely more challenging, that is for sure, and I will say, as someone who's a big fan of puzzle games, especially those graphic adventure style games that involve figuring out puzzles within the environment, I think these are just sort of okay. Honestly, it kind of feels like these are just thrown into a level editor to slightly rearrange the puzzles, and I wouldn't exactly say they're better. It's kind of cool taking a slightly alternate path through these dungeons now, but some of these puzzles are a bit more out there. Like this one that requires you to jump off the platform with this bomb flower with some extremely precise timing, or this one that requires that you shoot this cow 3 times in order to open the door. Or do you know how long it took me to find this switch in the Forest Temple? The Great Deku Tree already served as a big wake-up call for this. You have fire keys which can burn your shield in the first dungeon. Like, Jesus Christ, that is just cruel. There's also a puzzle that requires you lighting a Deku Stick and then crouching under a spiked platform on a moving tile. Like, the base game never even asks you to crouch, so why would you think to do that here? I don't know, man. They're definitely more challenging, and it's not a bad way to experience this game. I just think that the dungeons come off a little worse for wear in this. Try it if you're curious. I wouldn't recommend jumping into this immediately after a playthrough of Ocarina of Time. You might get a little burnt out. Now onto the 3DS version that was developed by Grezzo and released in 2011, only a few months after the 3DS's initial launch. This version of the game saw numerous changes that, if I'm being honest, kind of make this version the definitive way to experience Ocarina of Time nowadays. I already talked about the graphical updates earlier, so this is going to be all quality of life changes here. The biggest and best change to this version comes with how this game handles the inventory system. So now everything that was handled in the pause menu on the N64 version has been moved down to the bottom screen, allowing you to swap items around on the fly. You are also given an additional button on the touchscreen to map, as well as a dedicated one for the ocarina. You can even play the ocarina on the touchscreen now and pull up the notes for the songs as you play. Suffice to say, this gives Link some extra flexibility that I didn't think he absolutely needed or anything, but it's definitely nice to have. What's an even bigger bonus is that the iron and hover boots have been changed from equipment to standard items, meaning you can swap them on and off as you please. This makes places such as the water temple infinitely more manageable. While that, and they also added color-coded rooms to show where you can change the water levels, making this dungeon go from annoying to something way more manageable. My other favorite change for this version is the different ways that you can go about aiming your projectiles. Now you can still use the analog stick to aim, which thankfully the controls are no longer reversed, but now you can also use the gyro controls to aim too. This makes things such as the shooting galleries and collecting the big pose far easier given the extra precision you get. I'd really recommend playing this way. And truth be told, those were my biggest grievances with the OG version of Ocarina of Time. It's because of that the 3DS version is probably going to be my de facto way of playing this game going forward. Now, if Ocarina of Time 3D was just a graphically enhanced remake of the N64 version with some added quality of life features, I don't think anybody would be complaining. But Grezzo actually treated us to a couple of extra modes, so let's take a look at them. First up, we have the game's version of Master Quest. I'm not a big fan. So it's basically the same as the GameCube's Master Quest, but harder and less fun. So you still have the remixed dungeons, but now Link will take double damage from everything. Doesn't that sound like fun? Also, the entire game world has been mirrored, which I already hate in games like Mario Kart since it becomes super disorienting, and having it in a game like this is just as disorienting, maybe even worse. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't spend too much time on this. It's here if you want it, but it wasn't enough to justify a fourth playthrough for me. The other mode they added was a boss rush mode. This can be unlocked after clearing the forest temple and is accessible in Link's house by interacting with his bed. So I guess he's dreaming of these encounters? I don't know. But essentially this allows Link to replay any of the previously fought bosses with items and health reflecting what he should have for that point in the game. If you beat them all, you can take them on as a gauntlet where you get items to carry on to the next encounter. You get timed on all of these too. Not really sure if there's a reward for finishing this, but hey, it's here. Last thing I'll touch on real quick are some of the accessibility options. So back in the late 2000s and early 2010s, Nintendo had this weird obsession for kind of babying their players a bit. So how does it show up in Ocarina of Time 3D? Well, you got some minor things like Navi occasionally chiming in to tell you to take a break, which is kind of annoying. And then you also have the replacement for the Stone of Agony that gives you an auditory clue instead, which is honestly a bit more helpful. But the big thing that they added were the new Sheikah Stone visions that you can go to in case you get stuck, I guess. There's one outside of Link's house and one inside of the Temple of Time, and you can crawl in there and watch the chop up video of gameplay to help you find the solution to a puzzle. Okay. So it's an alright feature, I guess, assuming you're willing to leave the dungeon you're in and go all the way to one of those spots for a hint. Yeah, actually, no, it sucks. I wouldn't use this personally. There's nothing in this game that's really too hard that really warrants a hint like this, so I would just throw my face at it. Holy shit, I think this is my longest video yet. I don't know how much more I can really say about this game, so let's wrap things up. Ocarina of Time is truly a legendary game. It not only set the tone for every Zelda game that came after it, but it created systems that are still utilized by modern games. It has stood the test of time and is still played a ton to this very day, and is still considered one of the very best games ever made. I love this game, if it wasn't obvious enough with me glazing it for like an hour straight. I have very little to say about this game's flaws. My biggest issues were really addressed in the 3DS remake, and while some of the side content is pretty skippable, and there are a good amount of things from other Zelda games that I like more, I can still safely say that this is a top 5 game in the series for me. It created an unforgettable world with some genre-defying gameplay, and has one of my favorite soundtracks in all of gaming. If you haven't played this game before, this is a must play. If it's been a while, play it again. It's phenomenal to this day. And the wild thing is, the game that came after this, oh boy, it gets even better. Well, that's all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you for watching. What was your favorite memory of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider giving a like and subscribing. Thank you guys again. I'll catch you in the next video.